Okay, folks, we're going to get going. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I have with me today my two great friends. I have to say, 18 months of working on the technical expert group on sustainable finance, taxonomy working group, does do wonders to develop relationships. And I'm very pleased to be able to say that Sandrine Dixson-Declève, who's the president of Club in Rome, and amongst many other things, and Carel Cronenberg, the associate director of European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, he's careful to say he's an engineer by background, not a financier, have become good friends. And we've done a lot of work together, and we're very proud of the work we've done, which is to develop the European taxonomy along with many colleagues involved in this process. About 400 people have been involved in developing this taxonomy. We've chaired our respective groups. Carel and Sandrine co-chaired the manufacturing group, and they're going to talk about that today. I was co-chair of the electricity group with Carsten Loeffler, but of course we're all involved in the other groups, and that'll become clear as you listen to more of the webinars in this series on European Union Taxonomy Explored, talks with TEG experts. We're up to number 4 today. There's going to be another 2 months of these, including next week, a bonus webinar on the European Union Green Bond Standard. These are all at 1500 Paris time on a Thursday or on a Wednesday. The Green Bond Standard will be on a Wednesday next week. There are also supplementary seminars or webinars in different languages. We've had so far the Italian language one, thanks to some of our TEG members from Italy. There will be a Spanish language one, a German language one, a French language one booked in so far, and there may be more before we finished. We did the overview of what the technical expert, the taxonomy covered in number 1. That's available as a podcast and a webinar, and you can go to climatebonds.net/webinars to find all past webinars and how to register for new ones. Today we are going to focus on the manufacturing sector. But just as background, this is a key part of the European Union's action plan for sustainable finance. A great plan. I want to report something today. Today, literally just recently, a few hours ago, the European Union Council and member states agreed to adopt the taxonomy. Hey, Carel and Sandrine might not even know this at this stage. And that's the first step of the road to becoming formal regulation. The next will be to go to Parliament. So, exciting day for us. This taxonomy will guide disclosure by all other, all financial sector market participants on the investment side, amongst corporations, and once the EBA has finished with its work on new regulation coming later this year, on banks as well. So we have a lot that's going to happen here. Everyone is going to have to use the taxonomy if they call something sustainable in Europe. And that's a very important development, which I don't think people in other parts of the world have quite cottoned on yet, how significant this is going to be in terms of impact on the financial sector in Europe, and of course, on how European financial actors then operate globally. Because when they're reporting to regulators and stakeholders in Europe, they'll be reporting about their holdings in Singapore, in Colombia, and in Japan, not just their holdings in Europe. So it's a critical piece of infrastructure. It is something that has been resolutely tied to the Paris Agreement. Now, since then, the European Union has caught up with the TEG thinking and has adopted in December 2050 net zero targets, and also, more importantly, 2030 50% reduction in emission targets as per the International Panel on Climate Change's 1.5 degree report recommendations of 2018. This is very, very significant. We, for the first time, have a major government that has set targets which are actually in line with the scientists after 30 years of largely saying to the scientists, yes, 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 it looks bad, but we'll get there. We've learned the hard way it doesn't work. And the really important thing of that 2018 report was showing that emissions have gone up so much that we have to get them down so much that it's closed off a whole lot of options that we thought we had to transition. And you will have picked up, if you listen to the electricity webinar, some of the issues involved today. But today, it's about manufacturing. So welcome, Sandrine. Welcome, Carel. We have a couple of slides here. This slide will show at the end of the webinar, which is all the links you need to have. And of course, as I said, if you go to the Climate Bonds webinar site, you'll be able to find these links. But first, Carel, you suggested we put this particular picture, which is of a Swiss Army knife with the word taxonomy label on it, for those of you that are coming in just of audio. Tell us why.
Well, I work for the EBRD. And the EBRD, of course, is a multilateral development bank. We are closely involved in a lot of reporting activities. We issue green bonds. And for us, taxonomies are very important. It's a way to be able to report projects, but also to select projects, to communicate on projects with our shareholders, to communicate with on our project with our stakeholders. And I see the EU taxonomy very much as a tool that we apply in our organization. It's almost like a Swiss Army knife, which consists of I would say, many different elements. And we will discuss these elements today, like the elements related to mitigation finance, adaptation finance, do not significant harm, criteria, very detailed considerations about recycling and about differences between different type of, I would say, interventions like enabling or transition activities. So therefore, for me, the whole taxonomy is an army knife, is a tool that we need. It's not the end goal. It's a tool that we provide. And it is now that we need to use this tool in the correct way that we indeed achieve the objectives. But I think it's a great tool, and that's why I like this picture.
Thank you. Sandrine, can you give us a bit of an overview? We'll come back to transitions because, of course, a key part of this whole thing is around investments that will be correct in 2050, if you like the solar investments, enabling investments. In this area, it's all about transitions in this sector. We've got a slide coming up, but just give us a bit of an overview of what we've covered first to set the discussion going. And thank you, Felicity, who also worked on this, for joining us. Please, Sandrine.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just a few qualifiers before we start, John, because I think it's really important that we also indicate all the incredible people that worked with us on the taxonomy. So the first is that I actually represented Climate Kick when I was sitting, and still am sitting on the panel, and I'm appreciative to Felicity Spors, who is a very active part of our manufacturing team. We really went through quite a debate as to how far and wide we should cover sectors in the area of manufacturing. We have to remember that we talk about economic activity that have the greatest impact with regard to climate change, and also when we looked at the full spectrum of environmental and other environmental objectives. So we could have looked at a variety of different parts of the manufacturing sector, clearly. And many stakeholders have indicated to us that they don't understand why we have limited ourselves to the manufacture of low carbon technology, cement, aluminium, iron and steel, hydrogen, and chemicals in particular, including plastics. What we wanted to do was, first of all, and we agreed in the manufacturing sector, was to look again at those that had the greatest impact on climate mitigation. And clearly we needed to look at those low carbon technologies that needed to be taken into consideration, because they are the ones that we need as soon as possible to actually facilitate capital flows and investment to get to. And then we needed to look at those manufacturing sectors that for the moment have a high impact, but also through transitioning could really reduce their impact. And so that was the thinking. And I just want to reiterate that that thinking was taken on board by a variety of the different departments that we worked also through the European Commission. We have to remember that this whole process took on board 10 different departments across the European Commission, including the Joint Research Center, including the EBRD, the EIB, the EEA, and all of these conversations allowed us to start to funnel down into those manufacturing sectors that we felt were most important. There will be others that need to be looked at and that we've recommended should be looked at, especially when we look at the value chain and the need for greater circularity in materials. And I can talk about that a bit later as we get into more of the detail.
Okay, so I'm now going to take you, just before we get into the detail, this next slide to illustrate the transition. Can you tell us a little bit about what we're saying here, Sandrine?
Yeah. And I think that what's really important here again is people need to understand that this was a year-long process where there was a great deal of thought leadership, both on the energy side as well around transitioning, and your leadership, Sean, on the energy sector side with your team and Karsten and others, and then on the manufacturing side in particular. The need to look at the just transition, which we all know is so fundamental from a European context, and how that also applies to sectors. What does that mean when we start to move into sectors that typically are actually seen as polluting, and how can we actually enable even those that are high emitters to be able to transition to lower emissions and to get investments to enable them to transition? So it was very important for us to look both at the substantial contribution as well as what we call the do no significant harm factors, the thresholds which need to be reduced towards net zero by 2050. So we looked at that substantial contribution in terms of very low emissions. Then we looked at, okay, well, how do we actually reduce intensity? Not necessarily sustainable, but not significantly harmful. And then what is significantly harmful? And this is how we started to justify our methodology in terms of working with the manufacturing industries and also getting their feedback and understanding of how we could actually shift capital and shift investments towards some of their transition activities, most of which they would be able to demonstrate through their budgets and their revenues, and being able to really look at the way in which they could really shift towards lower zero emissions as fast as possible.
So if I could throw in a couple of points here. First, on the do no significant harm, the bulk of 75% of do no significant harm provisions in the European taxonomy reflect European regulation.
Yes.
So it's a way of articulating those for international investors or issuers understanding what we're doing in Europe. There are some measures, notably around adaptation resilience, which will impact some of these areas. If you're doing a large CapEx project, you need to be looking at the adaptation resilience things, because we know there's going to be heat stress where there wasn't before, for example, in many areas. So people are required to at least examine and act on recommendations. The actual guidelines are not that tight. The key thing is we institute process into these. But some of this is really common sense, right? You know, in the solar area, for example, you can't build a solar plant on a wetland. That's a do no significant harm provision. And, yeah, and I try to reflect those in the provisions. Sorry, Sandrine.
No, and I think that's what's so fundamental around the methodology that we put in place, was to be able to actually demonstrate that we were obviously looking at mitigation in terms of climate, but clearly in whatever decisions we are making, so I'm indicating a windmill that's being put in an area, one also that might have social impact, by the way, and that's a large conversation that we had, which has now been very much clearly put for the platform, the next phase, to look at what are the social impacts. But you could not actually foresee an investment in a particular manufacturing site which wouldn't take into consideration impacts on land, water, air, as well as that mitigating impact. But you're incredibly right in saying most of this is governed by existing legislation. And where we were very careful during the entire process is to be able to ensure that we had all the right references, that we worked with the European Commission, even with those new regulatory requirements that would be coming through the pipeline, that we actually referred to that, so that we could have a real sound methodological and analytical base, so that when actually investors, and in this particular instance, manufacturing companies, are looking at their next investment, that they would be able to know where they stood from a regulatory perspective in terms of do no significant harm.
Now, for our listeners, we do have a discussion in the report about adaptation and resilience issues. There'll be a separate webinar about that. But note that the crisis we're experiencing now is really highlighting the need for us to start addressing resilience issues that are embedded in the social discussion. Clearly, the depth of resilience in our health systems is something we're learning the hard way about in different European and different countries around the world. Understanding how social protection measures are critically important to ensuring that our population can survive a shock. Look to places where there's no sick leave and how difficult that is for the vulnerable, the lower paid in the community. We cannot go into what will be a century of continual shocks to our system as a result of the extreme climate we're going to have, even if on the best projections, without addressing these issues of resilience going forward. That becomes the further work of taxonomy. And, you know, it's already happening. We've seen 300 COVID bonds issued out of China in the last 6 or 7 weeks. Amazing. Now, getting some rigor around these things. Are they going to the right kinds of investments? Then becomes the forward work that we need to engage. But today, it's all about manufacturing.
Sean, can I just say that there was a question from one of those that are with us, the participants, on this very issue around whether COVID-19 is going to really affect the sustainable investments in manufacturing industries.
Yep.
And of course, what many are saying is this is not the time to be thinking about environmental investments when we are in the midst of a health pandemic, and we need to think about people first. What I try to say in my answer to the question is that that questioning is now being across the board. We need to think about an answer around resilience, which is what you've just discussed. We need to create more resilient communities. And at least in my mind and the studies that we've done where there are direct links between health impacts, air pollution, and climate change, and we will have a continuum of crises if we're not careful, this sustainable investment in actually the manufacturing sector and in other sectors will enable us to become more resilient to future crises.
Absolutely right. Now, Carel, cement.
Yes.
This is an example. What in the world are we looking at here? I'm a layperson. I don't understand this. Tell me what I'm looking at, because this is what you're going to find in the report, right?
Yeah, you will find it in an annex, and the annex is a huge document. It is well, over a few hundred pages. You will also find an Excel sheet. So for the really people that are like to dig into the numbers, you can find that information there as well. And it is all about numbers. And numbers are important. Well, first of all, why did we do manufacturing of cement in the first place? Well, we do it because it's cement. We will still using cement in 2050. We probably will using 20% more cement than currently because of adaptation measures, because of population growth, because of, I would say, infrastructure changes that we are heading for. On the other hand, cement is also one of the, I would say, most polluting components. 7% of worldwide emissions are basically related to the manufacturing of cement. Interestingly, after water, cement is the most used product in the world. So it's wow. I would say it makes a lot of sense to put it under the taxonomy list. And this is also why we selected projects. We get some arguments. Why did you look at glass? Well, we need to look at glass in the future, but in percentage-wise, it is a less important sector than the other sectors that we presented here. What we have done for those cases where there is no, I would say, clear low carbon alternative, and for cement, of course, you can use wood, you can use other materials, but in essence, cement is still needed. And in that case, we basically looked at what are the best practices and how can we come up with information, data that are sufficiently robust, sufficiently comparable. One of the data that is, I would say, monitored in a very precise way are data related to installations under the EU ETS. So that information becomes very clear. That information makes it also very obvious what are the best performing installations. So that's the reason why we have chosen, in this case for cement, to base the threshold criterion for clinker production on the ETS value. So what does it mean? It's 0.766 tons of CO2 per ton of clinker. Well, that's basically the value of which is being determined by the EU ETS for the 10% best performing installations in the world. This value will be updated on a regular basis, also because, well, the 10% best will change in time, but also because the manufacturer of cement is one of these so-called transition technologies. If you got a technological breakthrough in the cement sector, then we may at a certain moment end up with a much lower value, depending if this technology is becoming commercially available. And for instance, for steel, we see now a pilot going on in Sweden on using hydrogen and natural gas as the basis for steel production. And once this technology is becoming, I would say, commercially mature, then we may change the criteria for the threshold. So that's how the taxonomy works. We have made here two criteria: one for cement clinker, and the other for cement itself. And the reason that we have done that for cement itself is, in principle, clinker is the process where the most CO2 is being emitted. The cement is basically a mixture of clinker and inert materials. And we also want to promote to use, I would say, to limit the use of clinker in cement. Just one other element to it, because we got some, and it was also one of the questions, there was a lot of questions about, should you not look at life cycles, should you not look at other materials, should you not look at circular economy? Well, in essence, and then I'll also come back to this multi-tool, in essence, this already gives you some kind of basis for use of cement or in concrete and in the building sector, because taxonomy will also show you what are the activities, how much activities of a certain company are aligned with these criteria, and you may even assess your procurement criteria on the basis of cement that is in line with the EU taxonomy criteria. So this is what we see here. So under the motor hood, there is a lot of information and a lot of work being done, and this is just a part of the tables that we have presented in this 500 pages report.
So I want to say that I got really enthused about cement. I know this sounds crazy, during the course of the technical expert group, because 7% of emissions, like that is a big chunk of global emissions, right? And we're seeing technologies around now, or rather offerings to the market, where we can see 60, 70, 80% reduction of those emissions as being viable. And what really excited me is it looks like they can become available at comparable prices. We're not talking about price impost. That's the prize, I guess, all of this. You know, I sat down at the senior executive of Bharat Cement in India, the #4 producer, and they're already offering cement which is 60% reduction on emissions compared to their competitors. They say, I haven't done any verification of this. This is, of course, why we have the taxonomy as a benchmark, so people can now get verification of their claims. But also Heidelberg and Lafarge in Europe have been saying they do have product that is much lower emissions, that is available, that could come in. So we've got to push this. And the question now is, what do we do to implement this change and get, I personally think is achievable, is a 90% reduction in emissions in a very quick period. So this is a transition threshold. What we've said generally throughout the taxonomy is that at least every 5 years, we'll be reviewing the threshold and looking to tighten it depending on what's viable and what we need to do to achieve our European and global targets on emissions. So it's a starting point. Let me take you to another area which has been really important for us, which is this one, hydrogen. This is like the pivot point for the steel industry, the pivot point for other industries. Carel, explain.
Well, hydrogen is very interesting, and especially as a chemical engineer, it's basically an energy carrier. But it's a very special energy carrier because it's not only just about energy, it's also molecules. So it's almost like the Lego of the chemical industry. If you have hydrogen, and basically also using a carbon source, and that can even be CO2 that is just in the air, you can in the end manufacture everything. But first of all, it's an energy carrier. And of course you can, and basically what we see here is basically making a comparison of the energy carrier hydrogen with the energy carrying electrons. And we basically have determined the threshold just on the basis of what is the current threshold for electricity. What is the, and that is the threshold being determined by the electricity group as a threshold in transition. So at the moment it's 100, but it could be 50 in 5 years' time. Depends very much on how the renewable energy technologies are evolving. By the way, this number does include also life cycle and emissions.
And we've had a question about guidance. We've got guidance in the report about life cycle emissions.
Yes, yeah, we should look at that. And basically using electrolysis as the key production methodology to produce hydrogen, you end up to a threshold that is being mentioned here. But of course, it's very important to realize that thresholds are, I would say, technology independent. So if you're able to produce using gas and CCS, then you may also be able to achieve the threshold and being able to label your activity of hydrogen production as a green activity. What is very important with hydrogen as well is that it's a bit the same discussion like we had with electric cars. At the moment, we don't require yet for electric cars that the electrons that you use for the electric cars are produced by renewable energy. It's a bit the same for hydrogen for certain processes. For instance, if you start to produce steel with hydrogen as the basis, then, and that's a discussion that we need further, but if the technology comes there, do we require all the time the hydrogen to be in line with the numbers that are represented here? Well, that is the type of, I would say, technical discussions that we have in the group that also shows how much intertwined all the discussions are, and especially hydrogen. Basically, hydrogen is everywhere, so it's really connected to everything. And this is just the focus for the hydrogen production itself and the criteria where you can call the hydrogen production activity sustainable in line with the Taxonomy. And of course, you need also to comply with the other do not significant harm criteria. You also need to be aligned with the, for instance, the climate resilience criteria, that the electricity, for instance, that they are using for the hydrogen is coming from, I would say, hydropower plants, for instance, that are sufficiently climate resilient. That type of elements need to be taken into account as well. But that is that shows basically the overarching elements of the whole taxonomy.
I mean, I think it's fair to say we've got a bias towards green hydrogen inherent, but we've taken deliberately a technology agnostic approach in this area and in other sectors, because what simply counts is getting emissions down at this stage. There is a real challenge with the volume of hydrogen availability at the moment and for the foreseeable future. If, for example, we're going to shift our steel industry in the time we need to, which is like 10 to 15 years, to be zero net carbon, then that's going to need necessarily a lot of hydrogen as well as increased recycling, etc. And that's going to require low carbon hydrogen. So some of that will be green. This is the wind farms in the North Sea, generating hydrogen at night when we're not using them for power. But realistically, in major economies where we have a lot of local demand for power, a lot of areas like in North America or Japan or Europe, we are likely to have to import hydrogen. We're going to have to do deals. Well, this is beginning to happen. We have in Western Australia a 20 gigawatts solar and wind facility being built to generate hydrogen. The discussion's underway in Morocco about them doing the same thing. This becomes an opportunity. Countries have to decide they want to do this, but an opportunity to provide an export line of investment for countries that have the solar intensity. So, but we've got to advance this quickly is the question. Now, at the moment, it's expensive. But we do know, in the same way as in solar and in wind, that volume drives reduction of cost. The bigger the volume of orders, the faster the price drops. And this is what we have to look at in Europe. How can we generate the volume that will drive the price? And I'm going to say, in the early conversations at Climate Bonds that we've been having with some of the producers, the price drop opportunities look extraordinary. So we're very optimistic about hydrogen within a 10-year time frame becoming a major part of our economy. The main thing is to make sure that it's in line with Paris Agreement emissions threshold. There is no room here. There is no room for black hydrogen generated from unabated coal and unabated gas. And that's the clear message out of the taxonomy.
Yeah. Maybe just a remark, because you mentioned, of course, this is very much the manufacturing group, but of course also the infrastructure that is needed to transport hydrogen, and also the manufacturing of the infrastructure. And then we also come to the element of one of the other elements of the taxonomy for the manufacturing sector is also the manufacturing of low carbon products. So it goes beyond just this I would say this hydrogen slide. It's also very much about an infrastructure that is being meant to transport the hydrogen that is in compliance or in line with the criteria here is eligible to under the taxonomy. So that's also why it also shows again the broadness of the taxonomy, which is not only limited to the 60, 70 sectors that we have looked at.
Maybe, Felicity, I can ask you to jump in here and give us a bit of a flavour on this manufacturing of low carbon technologies. I'll just start off in saying we've had an email interaction with a battery manufacturer in the last few days who's creating batteries for electric vehicles and energy storage. And it's clear they qualify under both those areas in the electricity generation area. What else is in this area that people should know about? Felicity.
Thanks, Sean. So low carbon technologies covers all those technologies that support, or all the manufacture of products that support what we consider today to be essential for a zero carbon future. So think solar panels, wind turbines, but also think the energy efficiency measures in buildings, also think of what's needed in transport. So what you see in particularly this area of the manufacturing section is very much aligned with the other areas in the taxonomy. So it refers to the thresholds and standards in the building sector and in the energy sector as well. And I think that's really all you need to know. It's simply a list of technologies that are considered essential and therefore have a kind of fast track approach. And you need to justify, for example, we couldn't list everything. So the biggest request we get here is, why isn't my technology, the product that I produce, my super energy efficient XYZ included in this list? And the answer is because we didn't have time to screen everything that could be highly relevant, which means that under this part of the taxonomy, provided you can do a life cycle analysis and justify that this is green, like low carbon, zero emissions, using the life cycle analysis standards that we indicate, and that the emissions from the production of your product are lower than, the overall sum is lower than the emissions that the product that you're going to contribute to, you are in the taxonomy. So within this, there's two things you need to know. Is one, you might be in the list. So have a look at the list. Please go and look at the report and see if you're in the list. Two, if you're not in the list and you don't understand why, because you seriously contribute to solar, wind, geothermal, all the things that are listed in other areas, then you need to do a life cycle analysis according to the requirements there. That's clear on that section.
But some examples. We've actually put in a white list of building products, for example. So if you're a triple glaze window manufacturer, you're in and there's a bunch of SME opportunities here that I think people need to be aware of. If you can prove that what you're creating is an essential component or a straightforward component for another qualifying investment, then you're going to be in it. And there's a hell of a lot, a big slice of the economy that actually part of insulation manufacturers in the building sector. We've given quite a lot of detail, right? Anything unusual, just to throw in an example, Felicity, before we leave this topic, that you've come across?
I strongly recommend you go and look at the list, because there's many things that we can throw in here as examples. There's people on the phone who have other examples. Like you say, it covers pretty much anything, as long as you can argue the case that you are supporting low carbon transition, and you can do that in a way where your manufacturing process is not hideously contributing emissions into the air, then you could be in. So go and have a look at the report, and we'll come to that link. I think it's important that people look at the report.
Can I just add to that, Sean? I wanted to step in here because, again, everyone wants to debate what's in the report, but a lot of people don't know all of the discussions we've had to get to our final conclusions, and also the proposed methodologies and analysis that we've undertaken. At the end of the day, with regard to low carbon technologies, and also, as I indicated in the beginning, the kind of the debate around value chains. I mean, a lot of what we discussed, and I think it's one of the most thorough discussions we've started to have, and we've only started to have it. So watch this space, people. That is around where are metals and materials coming from? That is the circularity conversation. That is the fact that when, for the moment, we do cover batteries, we do have in mind that there are potentially issues there. We know that some of the materials that are actually in batteries, we need to think of from, again, a sustainability perspective. And all of that will need to be further refined as we move into the next phase in the discussions in the platform. So I think that what's really important to think about here is that there is a general move, and I would say even in other countries beyond just Europe, where we are all realizing that it's very difficult to decide which economic activities are truly green and which could be brown. And of course, we haven't even discussed the brown yet. And then how do you actually transition? But I think this is a really good first start. And then we need to build on it and also have discussions with other countries as how they can tailor their approaches based on some of the work that we've been doing.
If you're a green bond issuer out there and you choose to use the European Union Green Bond Standard, then you will need to use the taxonomy. But to be clear, if it's in today and you issue a bond or you disclose today, that's fine for the life of the bond. If the criteria change in the future, and we're saying every 5 years, we're looking at reviewing and changing, we're trying to provide some forward certainty in these sectors, then you will need to be thinking about future bonds being in line with the taxonomy. So there's a bit of guidance in there in the usability report about how to do this. What we don't want to do is a situation where we're making changes every week. Everyone thinks they have to update the existing financial instruments they've done. So we have thought that through. But now aluminium. Maybe, Carel, can you tell us what we've done in aluminium, seeing as we've covered cement so much?
Yeah, well, aluminium, of course, is an interesting sector because aluminium is, in essence, I would say Paris aligned, because the basis of aluminium production is the use of electricity. And the key emissions related to the aluminium sector are related to the emissions of the electricity production. So you could even argue that it is a I would say deep green technology in essence, if you could take care of the, I would say, other greenhouse gas emissions that take place. These are process emissions. If these are I would say sufficiently captured. On the other hand, there's also a challenge because aluminium is highly energy intensive. It uses a lot of electricity. It's one of the biggest electricity. It is the biggest electricity use area in the manufacturing sector. Aluminium plants are I would say, the biggest single electricity users in countries. And then, of course, you get a discussion about what level of, I would say, what's the level of carbon that you allow the electricity to be releasing in its production. So we basically have set up 3 criteria for aluminium. One criterion is related to the process emissions. These process emissions need to be significantly low and are related to the EU ETS standard. Secondly, we have an energy efficiency level that needs to be achieved. And finally, we have a level of the use of renewable electricity below the 100 grams per kilowatt hour. And what we have set for now as I would say, compromise, also taking into account that the amount of renewable electricity at the moment in the EU is a limiting factor, is that we would allow for, if an aluminium plant is highly efficient, in combination with a very low process emissions, that this aluminium plant could be considered as green. Or if it's not so high efficient, then if the aluminium plant is being used exclusively electricity that is below the threshold for the electricity production being set by the TEG. So it's a complicated area. And of course, I expect already questions about what do you do with power purchase agreements? Does this electricity have to come directly from a hydropower plant that is next to the installation, like for instance we have in Sweden? Well, now I'm a little bit putting on my EBRD hat and not so much the I would say the EU hat, because this is a controversial topic. Because there is an argument, well, you cannot green activities just buying green electricity, but especially for the aluminium sector, it's basically the only way forward to decarbonize deeply. And secondly, the EBRD we have a strong focus on basically non-functioning markets. So we very much endorse market-based instruments. So in my view, it should be able for an aluminium plant, because they don't have any other way to decarbonize, to be able to purchase electricity from the market, and basically using certificates of origin to cover the green electricity and to reach threshold. But this is a controversial topic, and I expect it will be worked out more in detail once the platform is in place and once the secondary legislation will come in place potentially in December on the taxonomy criteria.
We've already seen a green bond or issued against the taxonomy by Cadent in the UK, which cited a number of areas, including in the energy sector, the upgrading of existing gas pipelines to become hydrogen ready, for example. At this stage, if you are welcomed and encouraged by the Commission to start using the taxonomy and to start disclosing against it. If you make a case, as Carel has said, as an aluminium manufacturer, that will be well received. The final tweaking of these things will happen later, but we already have a market. Investors, we have 50 large investors who are currently working on screening the whole portfolio using their understanding of the taxonomy today. So get going. And hey guys, if you're an aluminium sector issuer, put out a bond and prove how it works, and let's test the waters in this. I'm going to say that this discussion, some of us on this call, are very keen to ensure that when it comes to aluminium, which is essentially electricity in a can, right? That's what we're creating, that we do use this as a way of driving renewable energy growth in markets, because aluminium is such a large user of renewable energy. And in the short term, interpretation is available. The Commission will then decide later whether it needs to tighten criteria or whether the market has established appropriate interpretation. In the building sector, for example, we've published principles. The top 15% of buildings in any one market from an energy efficiency perspective will qualify. You decide your proxies, you decide the case, you get an independent verification, and you're away. And then we'll tighten the rules around proxies once we see what works. This is how it's going to work here. We're not waiting to be perfect. We're getting going. But in iron and steel, what are we saying in iron and steel? Felicity, tell us.
Sean, I don't know how to address my echo problem, so maybe hand it to Carel, unless I can try and fix it.
Okay, Carel, over to you.
Well, maybe I'll just use your questions, because steel at the moment is, I would say, strongly related to the EU ETS criteria and based on those. However, we really see this as I would say, a temporary situation, because if, what I just mentioned already, if these technology are really becoming commercially available, and if we have got a commercial breakthroughs, then of course the criteria needs to be adjusted. Another element I think it's very important for steel, and I should have also mentioned it for aluminium, is basically recycling and use of recycled materials. That is strongly endorsed in the taxonomy. So if you are able to base your steel production on basically used steel, then you qualify as well. And that, of course, is an important element of the whole taxonomy. It is not only about efficient production, it's also very much about the efficient use of materials, which is by far the best, I would say, mitigation activity that you could build on. Unfortunately, we still need additional steel. We still need virgin steel in the market. First of all, because certain qualities of steel do require virgin steel. And secondly, the steel market is still very much growing. And dealing with this growth and dealing with growing demands is of course a challenge. And I also saw a question on what do we do with dams and dikes made of concrete? And of course, steel is also such a material that is highly in demand if you want to make this transition towards a low carbon economy. Of course, therefore, these criteria are so important that if you are going to use concrete, if you're going to use materials that are produced with a high emitting process, well, first of all, it is your task to limit the use of these materials. But if you have to use them, you can look at those materials that at least are used in the, I would say, the most efficient way, or in a way that is in line with the taxonomy.
It's worth noting in steel that this is a transition. This is an interim target, which will get tougher. Some good news recently. SSAB, that demonstration project in Scandinavia that by the steel company SSAB that Carel was talking about, they put out an announcement in January that they're planning to offer zero carbon steel with green hydrogen, renewables, and high recycling content by 2026. Now, let's see. Now, we don't know what the cost is going to be, but that's an exciting development. But it's not just there. Baowu Steel in China has made a similar announcement that by 2030 they'll be offering zero carbon steel. So we think this is going to change quickly. That hydrogen piece will be one of the key parts of changing the steel industry. So there are some interdependencies here to understand. I'm very optimistic that we will be able to tighten our criteria going forward. But for the next 5 years, this is what you got. Now, chemicals. Hey.
Just one point, because we have a question on steel. So while we're there, I just read, was asking, am I echoing still?
No, not really.
Okay, good, because Sean said I was echoing, so I was worried.
Yeah.
So the point about the steel standard being very high for recycling of steel, and I think just in response to that, yes, the standards are high because this taxonomy is to encourage people to do more. It's not to reward people who are doing okay now. Right? So just to kind of be clear about that. To actually encourage people to do more. And we have taken a global view of these sectors. So some of these standards are not just looking at how good it is for green efforts in Europe, but we're looking at what's possible and that is the view we've taken, particularly around steel and aluminium.
Ambition is critical.
Can I also add to that, or maybe you want to say something around the impetus for this? But we have to remember that the taxonomy originally, and still is in a taxonomy to demonstrate what green economic projects are. So in order to be able to say my green bond is truly supporting a green economic activity, or this taxonomy and the criteria are truly demonstrating what is green and moving towards mitigation. I mean, this is what we were tasked to do. And we've had several questions here indicating, is this going to push industry to move outside of Europe into other countries? And I would say, no, I don't think the taxonomy is going to have that kind of impact. Now, if we do go into an evaluation and a regulatory framework that starts to eliminate capital from going into brown industry, then yes, there will be more of an impact, but we're not there yet. And some would say we should be. Obviously, there are NGOs and some governments who feel that we should have been much more stringent in our assessment.
This is
maybe just, oh, sorry, just to respond to you, you can also basically completely change the argumentation, because this is a positive approach. So this is not about compliance. So basically, this is about channeling finance towards the green activities. So it could also work very positively, that it will just, I would say, stimulate, I would say, low carbon developments in Europe and basically crowding in finance. Because that's in the end.
Exactly, Carl. I mean, there's a question there about green bonds for the manufacturing sector. And I would say actually having a taxonomy, because it is quite hard to get green bonds for the manufacturing sector. But now with the taxonomy, this is actually going to encourage people to add this sector under green bonds. So I actually think it's expanding the market, not reducing it. And I agree with you, Carl, absolutely. It's a positive, very, very positive signal for manufacturing.
And this is the biggest area of expansion in understanding green finance, the taxonomy, because there has been very little out of the manufacturing sector because of uncertainty of what you should do and what qualifies. So now we've provided some level of certainty going forward. This is not just a European conversation. In the Chinese 5-year plan that's about to be released, there is a much stronger commitment to shifting the Chinese economy to a green footing. For example, there's a big discussion about the need to grow hydrogen, absolutely in line with what we've done in Europe. And that will be driven by incentives and regulation. Remember that China has the strongest measures to encourage capital flows to green already in place, and they haven't even got started yet. Japan, METI, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, put out 2 weeks ago a principles of transition, how to transition manufacturing towards the Paris Agreement goals. This is a global conversation, folks. There's not going to be anywhere to hide should you think that's an option. But let's move on. Chemicals. Tell us, Carel, in the chemicals area, what are we trying to do and what are we doing?
Well, again, in the chemicals we have, the chemicals is challenging because a lot of chemicals are, especially when you talk about organic chemicals, they use I would say fossil fuels as a feedstock at the moment. So that's one thing. They basically are an inherent stage of I would say hydrocarbons. You could even say that if you produce, for instance, plastics, it's just another stage of oil. And at a certain moment, if these plastics go to an incinerator and you produce electricity with it, then it is just an intermediate stage. That's one way to look at chemicals. The other way of looking at chemicals, and chemicals, for instance, also include fertilizers. Chemicals are highly needed in a low carbon economy. We will probably use more chemicals in the future than less at the moment. It's also very much related to make agriculture more climate resilient, but also related to, I would say, lightweight materials with a sufficiently long lifespan. That, of course, these are elements of the chemicals sector. And at the moment, we have been using mainly the criteria that we set up by benchmarks. So benchmarking 10% best. The greening can be achieved, and you can achieve your benchmarks by basically introducing also low carbon feedstock, including low carbon hydrogen, but also other feedstock that is being derived by low carbon processes. And of course, there is also the possibility to apply carbon capture and carbon use as well in the chemical sector. So these are all criteria that are there. We have a lot of questions about what to do with plastics and the production of plastics. There was a strong recommendation in the TEG report that plastics are okay into a certain extent that are being used for, I would say, sustainable or sufficiently sustainable applications. So basically, that basically means single-use consumer plastics are out, but plastic used for, this is for medical purposes, or plastic used for basically products like your iPhone, which we are talking to now, they're in. So that are elements that are taken into account in the chemical sector as well. One last thing, and that is that if you would like to change the chemical sector, there are two ways to change it. One way is indeed to go to sustainable feedstock, and sustainable produced hydrogen will play a hugely important role in this. But secondly, also to introduce electricity as a key source for heat And because a lot of chemical processes, they use heat as a starting point. And of course, there is to make that transition from fossil fuels to electricity, and at a certain moment also apply criteria on how this electricity is being produced is very important.
So we've got a lot of things in this particular report. Felicity, did you want to add to the plastics? You were getting very excited for a minute there.
I was looking at some really interesting questions. That's why I'm kind of diverted by these questions and answers, and I'm trying to answer them so people don't feel frustrated, so that there's not a sort of two-way mechanism here. So,
anyone you want to lift out? Anyone you want to talk about to the group?
Well, maybe I'll read one out. But this one about there is a criteria saying that steel plants use greater than 90% scrap. Do you have a view on the percentage of steel plants in the EU? And I think we answered that, which is we have a view on green steel activities, and we believe that this is plausible, and this is something to encourage people. So I think we answered that. But the one I was looking at was actually about why the taxonomy has added coal-based iron making, the blast furnace, and why isn't there a criteria for steel making through the basic oxygen furnace? And I think, Carel, I'd like to ask you that one.
Well, first of all, the blast furnace is still the technology that is being used for the production of virgin steel, and therefore this process that is now being developed in Sweden and will become hopefully commercially available in 2026 is so important, because then we may even try to remove the whole blast furnaces from the taxonomy. That could be one of the developments, and that's also how the taxonomy works. And of course, we have very specific criteria for blast furnaces, so only the highly efficient ones are being counted. We haven't set up criteria for basic oxygen furnaces because they are inherently already better, and they basically use recycled steel into a large extent.
Okay, we're at the end of our time, folks. Would you believe we could talk about this for a long time? It is a complex area. I need now, I'm looking for some parting thoughts and parting advice. We've got quite a few people on this call from around the world. One question is, how does this apply to other countries? Of course, Felicity has already said we have taken a very global approach to the application. We believe these are consistent with global reductions and global transitions. How we implement them in different countries will clearly depend on what governments do around policy, as in the energy sector, as the building sector, that applies as well, and the extent to which we can mobilize a wall of capital to support these things. And that is something that is absolutely the intention of this particular project in Europe called the Action Plan on Sustainable Finance. So, Felicity.
I'd just like to add to that, Sean, on the other taxonomies. You know, when we talk about global, we're also very mindful that this is an EU taxonomy, and that we are aware that there's a Japanese taxonomy. There's talk about one in South Africa. There's talk of, you know, it's other people are looking at their own taxonomies. But we will be working to ensure that there is kind of what you call it, interchangeability. So what we would hope to do is to work with everybody. So if anybody on this call is aware of countries starting up initiatives, the members of the TEG and the EXA will be very, very welcome exchanges or information exchanges about those actions, because it's really important that we align. We don't have to be the same, but we need to be able to translate in order that this really works for the good of climate.
And if I can build on that, Sean, I know we're finishing. I just wanted to say that clearly this is the beginning of a phase, as you've indicated and I've indicated. But let's be very clear that there is a continuation of looking at sustainable finance from an EU perspective. And there will be a building up of this particular taxonomy piece and also all the other pieces that have come out, including the bonds conversation. And I think it's important for people to realize that as that process moves on, there's also a discussion of how to use the way in which we've looked at the methodology and the criteria in a variety of different processes. So for example, from the European Commission perspective, they're already looking at how can they use some of these criteria in terms of the funding mechanisms that they have in terms of innovation and research. So there is now a broader conversation of when we're starting to look at what does green mean and what is a value chain perspective and how do we look at transitioning, of actually implementing that at a variety of different levels across decision making at the European level, and then also in discussions with other countries, including bilateral trade discussions and other discussions around innovation, research, and collaboration.
It's important to note the European Union has set up one of the recommendations of the high-level expert group on sustainable finance a couple of years ago, an international panel on sustainable finance.
Yeah.
That's the umbrella body to be able to look at collaboration around taxonomies. You will see some activities between China and Europe in this coming year, for example. There's already a commitment to work together on tackling this issue. There are, as Felicity said, taxonomy development programs in lots of places where client bonds are working at the Colombian and Mexican authorities. The Bank Negara, the central bank in Malaysia, has published some principles, and so on. The key point is things have changed. We are no longer talking about incremental improvements. We are no longer talking about best in class in every sector. We are now talking about what the science says are absolutes of what we have to do in every sector of the economy. There's work to build out that information base. All countries will contribute with their own taxonomy development in areas of specialization. And that will be a fantastic thing for collaboration around the world. But it's a different mode now. Remember, 50% cut in 10 years, or frankly, we're toast. That's what we've got to do. This taxonomy is predicated on that idea. And we expect to see other countries signing up to this now. We're seeing in more countries discussions about 2050 net zero goals. We're seeing more countries also talking about the critical issue, 50% cut in 10 years. That's what it's about. Carel, parting thought for our audience out there who's been patiently listening to us.
Yeah, well, I was thinking there's one element that we haven't mentioned, and I think that's, I would say, for me, it's maybe even the most important thing about taxonomy, and that is that it will lead to much more transparency. Being able to refer to criteria, being able to refer to a reference, being able to refer to a certain, I would say, forward-looking baseline will dramatically change the way we report. And there was this question about international harmonization. Having a taxonomy, being able to, it doesn't even matter what taxonomy you use, as long as you make very clear what are you reporting, how does your portfolio look like. This is really a big tool for transparency and reporting. I think that should be important as well. It's not a compliance tool; it's a transparency tool.
This is a procurement plan for the future.
Yeah.
It's a framework for
Absolutely.
what we have to do. When we're looking at stimulus, we should be using this. There's a lot of jobs in here, in many sectors. The SME provisions of the low carbon technologies in manufacturing sector, for example. If we invest into that framework, we will create jobs, which we're going to have to do. So it isn't a matter of choosing back to going to the old as a way of creating our economy. It's now a matter of focusing what we do in the future, not only to build resilience, not only to green because of climate, but green because if we address climate, we reduce the extremity of shocks that we will experience this century. We won't have to go back into this as badly as we have so far. That's why we've got to do it. Folks, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Felicity, Sandrine, and Carel, for all the work you've done over the last 18 months on getting this together. Read the report, folks. It's really cool. There's a lot of information in there. And we will be over this year doing more and more explanations, guides to it, and so on, until we get to the regulation, which will come into force in the latter part of this year. And then we're into a different world and a different territory. Thank you again, and thank you everyone for your interest and your commitment to creating a sustainable future, one that we have to have for our children.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.
Thank you, and bye.
Bye-bye.